All right, we are back. Excuse me. So anyway, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon and good evening, and welcome to another episode of Claims Corner. Today, our topic is going to be commercial claims and their complexity. Now, the reality is there's so much that goes into having a little trouble with my slides, so bear with me for a second. Things are not going in the direction they're supposed to go. Anyway, all right, there's just so much that goes into the handling of a commercial claim. Overall, most adjusters understand and handle these required steps appropriately. But there are other pieces of the claims process that are often overlooked or mishandled during the process. Today, we're going to talk about some of those steps. We're going to look at some of those steps. We're going to find what we see as some of the issues that pop up if the claim is not handled properly and the steps are not taken properly when they need to be taken for that particular item. Now, these are not all the steps or processes that should be handled, but these are ones that we either overlooked or become issues that make the claim more complex, more challenging than it should be. I like to say it's one of those issues that causes the claim to go off the rail or become nuclear, or even worse, which I've seen, causing a train wreck, carrying a nuke that falls off a cliff into the Pacific Ocean, causing a nuclear tsunami that sends a shockwave into space, signaling a hostile alien race to come down and blow up a city near you. Yeah, you think it's that bad. And we've seen stuff where it's that bad, where when you look at the claims process and you look at the steps that should have been taken, it should have never gone to that level. And I know I use these terms and analogy because we want a claim to run smoothly. A policyholder wants a claim to run smoothly. Everybody is expecting the claim to run smoothly. And as an adjuster, the policyholder is looking to you. They're looking to you for the guidance, the professionalism. They have not experienced a claim before like this, and they need a professional flood adjuster to handle, to provide the guidance and handle what they need to handle from the beginning. Not during a claim. Let me rephrase that. Not 100 days into a claim. Not at the end when the estimate's written, when it's finished. Not when you're ready to settle a claim. Not when you realize, oh, I missed this X, Y, and Z in order to document the claim in order to reach the settlement. Okay. To me, when we're missing those steps, and we're overlooking those steps, that's when that claim becomes nuclear. You did not manage that claim from the beginning like it should have been managed. And you notice I use the word managed. As a professional commercial adjuster, whether it's the property side, whether it's flood side, we manage the claims process from the beginning to the end. You manage the expectations and you fulfill those expectations of the policyholder or really any key player that's involved in that. And again, like I said, if any step is overlooked, this can cause significant delays, can result in poor customer service. It can even result in an adjuster not getting paid for that claim. Yes, no payment is being made to the policyholder because the claim was not properly documented and they didn't have an insurable interest, or they didn't have a financial interest, or they actually didn't have insurance at all. And so the adjuster does not get paid for what they wrote. I have seen that situation before. So now that I've caught your attention, let me introduce the team with us today. Here with us today to talk about this, to have a conversation about the complexity, commercial claims complexity. We have David James with us. I think he's on camera. We have Raven Grant. She's going to join us today. Michelle Martineau. David's also going to have a couple roles. He's going to talk about some stuff. We were going to have Scott Stevenson on, but David's going to actually take his role. Kelly Bauer and myself, Craig Fowler. Okay, we're all part of the training department here at CNC. We're all part of the claims department here, and we're here to work with you all and talk to you about the complexity claims. Now, this claims corner is a little different than what you've seen in the past, because in the past, obviously, we had a guest speaker on. The guest speaker talks about a specific subject. Well, our guest speakers today, if you want to call it, are the people in the department that see the results and know how we can be successful if we follow the steps from the beginning to the end like we should be. And that's what we're going to chat about today, is some of these steps that we need to make sure we are not overlooking. And so where do we begin? All right, so where we begin is really, we're going to start at the foundation, okay? We're going to start at the foundation. And when I mean foundation, I'm really talking about the construction of the building from the foundation up. I mean, how many of you really consider this before you head out for an inspection? You think about the construction, really knowing the building before you go out. And why does that really matter? It matters because, again, you are managing that claim. You're not the adjuster. You are really the manager of that file. And knowing the construction, knowing the materials, having an idea of the layout, the size, all prior to inspection, the height as well. You know, having all this information all prior to inspection is valuable for setting the expectations, knowing what you're going to be doing when you get out there, looking at the property properly, setting proper inspection times, and making sure everybody that needs to be out there is out there at the same time. I mean, being able to say, okay, based on what I'm seeing, what you're telling me on this call and about the construction, I need these following people out there involved, because sometimes you're going to be dealing with a very large commercial claim, a very complex claim. But here with us today, right now, introduce you to David James, and he is going to talk to you all and go over some of these ideas about when we're talking about construction and how it can affect the claims process and how we need to be looking at it. So David, you're on. I see you down there in the corner. I'm sorry, I got some kind of screen monitor issues here. I'm in the broadcast booth, and it's
can
on
you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right, good. Thanks for having me on. Like you said, I like the way
you were forced to be on, but go ahead.
I don't mind at all. You're right when you say you're not just an adjuster. I mean, there's several hats that you wear when you have a claim. You're not just going out there and taking photos, writing an estimate, and passing it on and moving it to the next person. I mean, it's, you doing the right thing. You've got to do your homework, like you said, before you go out to the inspection. Be prepared. And one of those things, as far as the construction, as you can see, if you go to the next slide, the categories of these commercial properties. I mean, there's different types of, there's 6 of them that we've got up there. There's all types. So you got, the hospitality, places or buildings that fall into the hospitality. It's going to be your hotels, your public houses, your restaurants, cafes, sports venues, nightclubs, amusement parks. I mean, we may run into all of those type things. The retail, obviously, that's going to be your strip malls, your showrooms, the retail stores, offices goes without saying as far as your office buildings, healthcare. You've got nursing homes, hospitals, the medical centers, multifamily. That's going to be your apartments, educational, obviously the schools and the colleges and the universities, industrial. You're going to have warehouses, automobile repair shops, different types of workshops, factories. Just a couple of statistics to put this in perspective for you. In 2018, 5.9 million commercial buildings contained 97 billion square feet of floor space. So that was an increase of 56% in the number of buildings and 90% in the floor space since the early 80s. There's a projection out there by 2050 that the floor space for commercial buildings is expected to surpass 124 billion square feet. And that's going to be a 33% increase from 2020, the early 2020s. The education, the office, the warehouse, they make up 60% of that floor space and 50% of the buildings in general. So if we look at the material, excuse me, the building material used in commercial versus residential, In general, the materials used for residential construction, obviously, we all know that they're going to be much different than in the commercial. Typically, the commercial buildings, they're going to contain concrete, metals. You've got the drywall, the asphalt. Structural steel makes up 40% of the material as far as the market share for the buildings, followed by the concrete. Average home, they're going to use the timber frame construction because timber is considered the most cost effective and appropriate structurally for the smaller size buildings. While some homes some do have steel framing in the construction. I mean, let's face it, the average homeowner, you generally can't afford to have a steel frame home, right? Commercial constructions, commercial construction projects, buildings, they're going to be larger, more complex. That obviously is going to demand different materials, right? To be able to withstand and house that and complete that makeup. So the steel frame construction, is most used for commercial projects because it's more resilient. Okay. It also allows for taller, larger buildings that can last longer. It is essential to consider the quality and the rating, the construction techniques whenever the property that you're going out there to look at. And, it's funny that we're talking about this just last night. I was watching the news, and I believe it's in Minneapolis, where there is an architect, someone that has actually built I think it was 25 stories, if memory serves me correctly, to where this is a commercial building that is made of wood, and it's kind of like not a guinea pig, but it really is, but it's like a design to see how it works, and it may lean towards that. So, don't default to just concrete or steel for commercial buildings. You want to do your homework and look out and, look at all the facts and consider all that stuff. So, again, be familiar with your surroundings and what you're walking into instead of just going out there, unannounced and just showing up. As far as codes, permitting, there's stricter regulations than residential for these commercial buildings. They're going to require to adhere to the specific codes and permits from the local city, wherever it's being constructed. Okay, they're going to have different rules and regulations for the building materials, the electrical systems, the plumbing, obviously how it's being built, the design and size all fall into that. Okay, some additional things that come into play are going to be to protect or for safety concerns related to elevators, IT concerns, handicap, parking lots, garages are just some of the ones to name a few. Okay. Cost. Let's talk about cost for a second. Obviously they're going to vary between residential and commercial. Even if they're kind of the same size. We talked about that already as far as the material. They come from the material and compliance. It's going to be related to the equipment that's needed, let alone the material, the overhead, and the labor involved, the number and the quality of workers, and the specialized equipment. They can play a big factor in the cost, rightfully so. Okay, depending on the design, labor is going to go through. Most times, it's offered or it's obtained through a bidding process. It's going to go to the lowest price, capable of being able to do that, right? So in contrast, residential, it goes up. We can run those bills up as far as the overhead and the labor and the equipment. Residential construction is usually on a much smaller scale. All right. Commercial projects, they're often funded by a corporation with the financing through a bank. Okay. A government agency, a wealthy owner or developer. Okay. As we know, the residentials, there's usually, the homeowner has obtained that funding through their mortgage company, and they are responsible for that cost. All right. One last thing before I turn it over to you, Craig, is the measuring. Okay. When we're looking at these commercial buildings, okay, you may default to, or you may find it easy to, we want to look at the overall square footage of a building. Okay. An example may be that you determine that the building is between 15 and 20,000 square feet. All right. However, though that it's not created equal. All right. Not all 15,000 square foot commercial buildings are created equal. There are several techniques with as far as measuring that you need to take into account. All right. Help you evaluate the size and the functionality of that building. Usable square footage. What is that, you may ask? It's the amount of space that a commercial building offers for a specific tenant. Okay. You need to know how much of that is available. Rentable square footage. That's the amount of space that a tenant can occupy, as well as the percentage of the common areas that they may be able to use. An example of that, we've got a commercial building that has a lobby, a small cafe, other office spaces that you may have to determine the square footage for a prospective tenant. Okay. The other factor is going to be the gross square footage. Okay. That's the measurement of the entire building and likely the size that's going to be presented if you're looking at it from a listing standpoint or an overall standpoint. We need to try to take that into consideration and help you go from there. All right. That's all I have for that piece of it, Craig, if that's where we're at.
Perfect. I'm glad you mentioned measuring and size and et cetera, because that is extremely important. And having this understanding about the size of the building and kind of layout, like you're talking about the lobby and everything, and knowing this information before you go out and really requiring as much information you can before you make that inspection, before you go out there. Because a lot of times, you're looking at the deck page and you're looking at the coverages and you see the coverages, just for example, says 15,000. You're like, okay, this is going to be a small building. And then you get out there and you realize it's a much larger building and there's potentially other insurance out there. Maybe they just had to write a little small policy for this, or they're hopefully they'll never have a loss and they're trying to self-insure the rest of it. So you really don't know what you're going to encounter until you go out there and actually have a conversation with the insured. But if you're hitting it beforehand, maybe you're using something like Google Maps and looking at Google Maps and getting identification of the property and doing research on that and having that conversation with the policyholder prior to going out there is a key to saving some time on the inspection process. I mean, think about this. You're going out on a 5,000 square foot warehouse that is just one large room and maybe a couple offices. The time you're going to spend out there is going to be a lot less than if you had a 500,000 square foot office building with 100 rooms and 100 sub rooms. And now you're spending a lot more time. I mean, think about what's going to be longer to adjust. Obviously, the one the 50,000 is going to take a lot longer to go out there and look at that. And when you realize it's a larger building, there's probably a very good chance that there's some blueprints, there's some layouts, there's all kinds of documentation that can be obtained prior, so that you do have an understanding about the building and that you can estimate your time out there more appropriately. And you can even consider when you're talking about the people that are involved that are going to be out there with you, you can work with them and manage them. And so they have the expectations of the time you're going to spend out there.
That's right. Let me say something real quick as far
Absolutely.
as going to that. You mentioned doing your homework and we talked about that. Having a conversation with them, they may have updated some things, done some remodeling. So if you're using old data or the original data that's carried over from the agent's office or whatever file is coming from, that's only going to help you. They may have remodeled a portion of it. There's different material involved. So just being prepared again is the theme and key. So.
Yeah, I mean, just look at these two diagrams that were done. One, obviously, on the bottom left is a little more simpler diagram. That's a little bit easier. And, the time you're going to spend out there is a lot less than what you see here at the top right. And a lot of that can be acquired prior to that inspection. When you're out actually having that conversation with the named insured or some of the other key players that are involved in the loss, you can have that conversation, discover, what are we looking at? You know, how am I going to get out there and what I'm going to look? This also leads to something, you know, on the flood side is when you're out there looking around, you have a large building. There's a really good chance that you're going to come across multiple water lines. You're going to encounter multiple water lines, multiple heights throughout that building that could have a significant difference. I mean, one side of the building could have a couple inches of water and the other side could have no flooding, none at all. Okay. And it's very important to understand that so that we're not writing a full estimate on the flood side for damages that did not occur, that you do not have the direct physical loss. Just because you see flooding in one side doesn't mean the rest of the building flooded. Doesn't mean the rest of the building flooded at that height. There could be variances in that throughout that building. And it's extremely important to document that properly. Here's a really good example of one where we had on one side of the building, 8 inches. On the other side of the building, 39 inches. Okay. Now, here we did not reach that 4-foot threshold where we would possibly be going up and painting to the height of the ceiling, whatever it happens to be, and doing some other stuff. But if it was above that, you're going to have a significant difference between one side of the estimate versus the other side of the estimate. That has to be not only documented throughout why you did something, but make sure it's clearly noted in the narrative why something was done. I've seen other situations where only a small portion, kind of like in the center of the building, flooded and the rest of it did not. Okay. You think about when you're out there and you're looking at this, you really need to draw a picture of what took place. I don't know if some of you people were on our last, if y'all attended, some of our guests attended our last claims corner where we had night inspections out there. But there were some key things that they talked about during that presentation that I really liked, and it was about telling the whole story. It is the adjuster's job. It is your job to tell the whole story. You have to remember that you're out there physically seeing it. Somebody sitting behind that desk, the examiner, they're not seeing what you see. They're not realizing what you are not visually seeing what you're seeing. So they also made a point about going out there and touching and feeling and experiencing the damages. And that's truly what an adjuster does. We feel the damages. We understand the damages. We don't want to be sound, we become one with the damages. And that's kind of a weird way of putting it. But that's how, when we're looking at this, that's how the documentation should be done. And think about it, that's how it should be brought back to your reporting so that the desk adjuster can feel and experience what you witnessed. And by going in and documenting these things like multiple water lines and really explaining what we're seeing throughout here helps the examiner understand this. And so, but we do see back to the water lines. I mean, I've seen multiple situations where there are multiple water lines throughout a building and there's significant differences. And now is the significant difference because the building is so large, or is it because the flooding only came in on one side, or is it because the building is unleveled? Whatever it happens to be, that should be documented in your file and explained why something was done. Now, after a loss, some of the things we will experience, especially in a large commercial buildings, where we're going to have some key players involved. And let's say there's a contractor, roofing company, mitigation company, whatever, tear out possibly is already, knew I was going to do that. Sorry, I want to keep on that one. Tear out is possibly already started. I mean, maybe it started prior to the inspection. Maybe the roof is already being repaired prior to the inspection, or maybe even prior to the first call that's being made with the policyholder. Drying is possibly started. You know, they had some roof damages come in and it caused rain inside the building where they're in there drying, or we had a flood that comes in and causes, and they're actually already drying. You got to remember, these are commercial claims. A lot of these people already had the finances and stuff to be able, or the crew on hand to be able to start the mitigation work, start the drying process. They have the resources to begin the repairs. Okay. So a lot of times they're not waiting on an adjuster to inspect. They're documenting their information. Hopefully they're getting their information right. And they're going back with the repairs because they're in the business to do business and make money. And longer building sits, longer some places not occupied where they can't occupy because the tenant, you know, they had to move the tenant out because the place was damaged. They can't get out there. they're not going to wait on that because it's money to them. And so we have to make sure we're out when we make that call, we're discussing this with them as well. But what I'm getting at is this kind of leads us to incurred cost. Okay. And we may come across specialty items. Like I said, the general contractors are involved, mitigation company, the file may have been reported late. In these situations, we do not use database pricing. Okay. We need to look at incurred costs, not the estimate, but what has already occurred. What has the contractor already done? If they've gone out there and replaced the roof, you're not going to go use an estimate. You're not going to go use the database pricing to write that roof estimate. You're going to talk to the contractor about their incurred costs and what they did. And then you're going to be able to look at that estimate and figure out, okay, we can allow for X, Y, and Z, but we can't do this and this. And you're going to have that conversation with them, explaining what is going on. Same thing, I see this a lot, is where we'll go out, adjuster will go out and the flood loss cleanup has already occurred, but we do not have an estimate on hand. And so we just write an estimate based on the database pricing. And then we discover later that that is actually incorrect. Okay. Because it is incorrect. Obtain the already incurred costs. Discuss this with the named insured, or really whoever the other key players are involved. Have that conversation on what you need to help them substantiate their loss. Again, don't use square foot allowances for cleaning, especially like a parking garage, especially when the file's they've already done the clean, because what's going to happen, you're going to have an overpayment. There's going to be an overpayment. What was the actual cost? What did they charge? Did they hire somebody to do it or did they not? I have seen a claim where database pricing was used to do flood loss cleanup in a parking garage. Okay. So over $100,000 for just flood loss cleanup. They use the database pricing. The insured provides a statement later on about their labor hours and how many employees they used and what maintenance people they used that worked for them to do the cleaning. And the estimate, the incurred cost they spent on cleaning that garage area was less than $15,000. Is substantial overpayment screaming in anybody right now as you're listening? Because that is what had happened there. Okay. It is something that they have already done. So why would we be using database pricing? Talk to the insured prior. Who do you have on site? Who's doing your work? What's going on? Let's get that documentation. And another big piece of that is you can also have that conversation with them. If they say, oh, I have my employees on site and they're doing this. Well, let's have the conversation with them about, are they doing it right? Are they doing it within the channels of the policy language? Are they doing something that is not covered? And you can do that prior to them actually going out there and doing something. Then you have a better understanding. Okay, hey, we can pay for this. We can't pay for this. You know, the same thing applies to wind damage and damage related to other perils. Do we have actual physical damage to the roof that we need to go that, or is it something else? Maybe it's maintenance or wear and tear that we have an exclusion for. That's the conversation that has to be had. And again, the business, they want to get back. So they're not waiting on you to start the repairs. So there are a lot of situations where we're dealing with a large commercial claim. We will have incurred costs. And we need to make sure we are addressing that. Also, something else when we're dealing with commercial claims, specialty items. Kind of the same concept applies to this. I mean, specialty items, these could be building items. They could even be contents items. There is a good chance that you're going to come across something that you are not familiar with, or it's extra large. It's a much larger than you ever experienced before, like a transformer. You go, oh yeah, I've experienced one of these and it costs about 50 grand to replace. And now we're looking at something that's 10 times larger than you experienced. Are you just going to add 10 times that amount? No. I mean, here's where, again, we're not going to be looking at database pricing. Okay. Here's where we're going to talk to a specialist, an outside source, a technician, somebody, again, the policyholder's probably already, the named insured, they're probably already back in the service trying to get their buildings repaired and get back in the service. And they're going to hire somebody to look at their elevators or their escalators or their transformers or their walk-in freezers. They're going to hire somebody to look at doing potential repairs. Is it repairable? Can they just rebuild some of the parts of it? Does it have to be replaced? These are things that they're going to go ahead and work on doing. Now, list some of these are specialty items, and some of them kind of are, because, I mean, what's a fire suppression system? If you tell me my fire suppressant system is damaged and you tell me it's $100,000, I'm going to say sure, but what I'm going to ask for is proof, one, that it's damaged, two, can it be repaired, three, is there any other upgrades or anything that's involved in it, and then actually what the cost is involved in it, so that I can look at an estimate and break all this down and figure out what we can technically owe or what should we actually remove the estimate. But this is, again, is a specialty item that we come across. And I know you notice here on the page I added lockers and church pews as well. And the reason I added these because church pews or lockers just came up in a kind of an audit. And so I just wanted to bring that up, a FEMA audit, kind of bring that out again to everybody. We've already pushed it out once, but I want to bring it out again. That if you come across a locker, they're the same as a church pew. They're considered by FEMA to be a furniture and fixture, whether they're affixed to the building or not. And so it's going to be written as a coverage B personal property item. Roofing, the same thing, specialty item, like a composite or rubber roofing system, solar panel roofing systems. There's a trend in adding solar panels and adding solar shingles to roofs. Do you have a price for that? Do you think there's a price in the your estimate program for that? No. And again, this is where we have to have that conversation with the key player, who's involved in this, who is going to be doing the repairs, have they already started the repairs, and make sure we are properly addressing these items. Now, the list that you see here is not a full list. It's just a list of some items that I know that are out there that I've seen that have popped up that you look at and go, why did we use a database pricing on this when a walk-in freezer? Yeah, there's a price in there and Xactimate for $30-something thousand, but why are we using that? One, can it be repaired? Does it have to be replaced? Or can parts of it be replaced? Or parts of it can be salvaged? So we look at those things in specialty items. And I know David, he wants to jump on canopies because that's another one that's out there. Canopies and stuff like that. So David, you go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna. I was talking and then I realized I was on mute for a second. Sorry. But going back to the incurred cost, real quick, I wanted to say something. I mean, that's the correct. Get this mute button to work and unwork.
Yeah.
That's part of the duties as a policy holder, right? I mean, they need to prevent further damage. So you may run across that to where they actually, those companies out there, the mitigation companies, the damage is going to get worse if they don't start that. So, I mean, that's not uncommon, and that's part of their duty to do that. So we expect them to do that. And like you said, we want to use our best judgment to see what's reasonable and what's not. The estimating software, it just gives you an idea of what it's going to cost. Some folks are going to be higher, some folks are going to be lower. So it gives you an idea to see what's reasonable and what's not. Going to the specialty items, the canopies, for example, these things are there may be a generic one in the estimating thing, but we really want to rely on the contractor, the folks who built it. I mean, because these are they're branded, right? Particular brand. It may be something custom. That's where we go back to the experts, the contractors, the engineer, the design, whoever built the policy holder, whoever built it, whoever had it designed. We go and ask them for documentation. What can you give us to support this estimate? We want to make you whole again, but we need specific information to do that. Same thing with the roofing. I want to touch on that. You've got solar panels on there. Lots of, as far as I know, on the residential side, lots of folks get a discount from the city for a tax break for having solar panels on their roof. Some folks, they may not own that. They may lease it from the city. So we want to get a copy of the contract to see who actually has ownership of it. If it's in the way, or if there's damage to it, does the policy holder have ownership of it? Are they responsible for it, or is the city responsible for that? So you want to get all the contracts in place, all the material you can to make sense of it, and see what's what. So.
Very true. I mean, and then like you said on the estimates, the actual estimates, I mean, who are the parties involved? Who is actually doing the work? That's where you need to go out and get their actual estimates for that. Which leads us to our next slide when we're talking about the, we've mentioned this a couple of times, the key players, but who are the key players involved in this? As a commercial claims adjuster, you got to be experienced in customer service, management skills. You're the professional out there. They're counting on you to help them with coverages and explain things to the process and what they should and should not be doing. And, when we talk to the key players, there's many times that you're not working with the named insured. They're too busy running their business. They're too busy involved in something else besides the claims adjustment. They're out there, again, to make money. So you may also be involved with the corporation or somebody other than the named insured that's at that location. And so when you're out there with the key players, you need to realize some of the things that we have to make sure we're doing. If it's not the named insured, okay, who's involved? We need a letter of representation or authorization for the named insured to handle that claim. You need to obtain the articles of incorporation to confirm who is authorized, approved to sign the paperwork. Is the CEO, is the CFO, whoever it happens to be, do we have the authorization to do that? Because they can't just go out there and say, word of mouth, oh, he's going to be involved in this. And then they're signing the proof in advance and the non-waiver and everything else without some type of proof that they are actually approved to sign that paperwork. We need to make sure we identify the person who can sign it, their title, their authority level has to be documented that. When we talk about the other key players, here's just a list of some of the key players that you may be involved with. Again, maybe the named insurer, or maybe a management contact or executive board member, maybe somebody from the board of directors. It could be a general contractor. It could be a public adjuster. It could be an agent. And in some situation, I'll go back to public adjusters real quick. Everybody, when you hear public adjuster, a lot of people go, oh, it's public adjuster. Oh my gosh, public adjuster. Well, when you're dealing with a large commercial claim, there's a lot of times somebody will hire a public adjuster because they do not have time to deal with the claims process. So they trust a public adjuster. And there's some public adjusters out there that are very truthful and honest and will just say, okay, here's what we owe, here's what's been done, et cetera, et cetera. And so we need to just make sure when we're dealing with all these parties that we're getting them involved in the claims process early, okay? And another key part is when you're talking to these parties, again, you may be dealing with the agent, you may be dealing with the broker. We're dealing with a couple lawsuits right now where the named insured is completely out of it. The broker is doing everything for the named insured, okay? And so these are just situations where we work closely with all the key parties, and these people, they should be identified early on. They should be identified at the call who is going to be out there, and ask the questions while you're out there when you're dealing with the key players. Who has access to the business records? Who is overseeing the property, the recovers, the repair? Who will you meet at the loss location? Really, really big one is who has access to all the rooms in the building, okay? Not just, oh, okay, I'm gonna get you over here, but who has access to every single room, especially if you're dealing with an apartment complex. And the apartment complex is flooded and every single room is flooded. And as an adjuster, you have to look into every single room and measure every single room and document the damage in every single room. Because if you do not have access to every single room, you cannot just assume room 101 is the same damage as room 102. Just assumption doesn't happen, even though they're right next to each other. We do not know, and so it has to be documented. And so identifying this prior to the inspection during that call is huge to a successful scope, and eventually it's successful claim settlement and closing the claim. I know we're kind of running.
As far as the key players, let me just comment real quick. When you say successful scope, that's key. Like you said, the earlier you get them on, don't be afraid to have, anybody's more than welcome to be on site and go through the inspection and walk the scope. That way everybody can come to an agreement instead of the back and forth that prolongs the cycle time. That term's thrown out there, and it just makes everything go smoother. Usually everybody involved, everybody's in an agreement. You can iron out the differences if there are any, and that's just, it's getting everybody involved.
Yeah, the big thing is you're ironing out those differences. You're getting everybody on the same page, and it goes back to what we talked about at the beginning. You are the manager, the professional on the claim. You manage that claims process. All right, so CPA, some of the experts also should be out there involved, and these are we could classify these as key players as well, because at some point you're probably going to come across one of these experts, and you're going to identify this. there's a good chance you can identify this information prior to going out there. I mean, the CPA, is their stock or contents damage? Remember, it's not the price the insured sells the item for, but what they paid for that item. And so we need to make sure we're getting the invoices, the documentation, and it could be either a CPA that's hired by the company, or it could be the insured CPA that's providing us with their account records and everything that we need to see in order to make sure that determination is out there, okay? We also could use possibly a CPA. We get piles and stocks of piles of contents out there. Are you going to go through and filter through all those? You shouldn't. CPA can come in and help identify the key points of what were damaged and not damaged. So really it's getting them involved immediately and getting a salvor involved immediately out there, because there's a good chance there may be some salvage value in a lot of this contents out there, or stock or building items, or something that's actually damaged, but there could potentially take pieces of that and salvage it and give it to a third party and go through the whole process. You know, engineers. And what I mean by engineer here, it's not just the structural issues that, like we see in this picture, where a wall blows down and we're not sure what happened. Was it built properly or anything like that, where an engineer can go out there and make that determination, but also a building engineer or equipment engineer, they'll go out and they can assess something and determine, yeah, this particular item was damaged, but it can be repaired. And there's specialists out there that do that. There's equipment specialists out there that can do that as well. And then, you know, bringing in a general contractor, it's not your responsibility to bring in the general contractor, but a lot of times a general contractor can be brought in as an expert to help the policyholder assist. And so having that conversation with them from the beginning helps us understand that. And now I threw this picture up here of all the damaged stock in dry boxes. And, you know, if it's a flood claim, one of the big things that I like to point out is what was damaged there, what's actually damaged, and who identified these items as being damaged. You know, if you just said these items are sitting on the floor and they're all damaged from floodwaters and they're sitting in those boxes, well, the first thing that comes up is they're not damaged. I don't see direct physical loss to these items to make a justification or recommendation to actually let's allow these. So again, we're going back to the need for the adjuster to properly document every single thing they see out there in a loss. And the best time to do that is when you're there. So we're gathering all this information prior to showing up so that when we get out there, it's easier for us to manage that claim like we should as an adjuster. All right, so now that we've covered some of the daily, like I'll call them just daily requirements and things like that, or daily reminders of handling commercial claims, I want to kind of focus on one of the issues that we see that's commonly out there that can be misidentified or mishandled. That's the best way to do it. It's probably one of the biggest issues we encounter on a commercial claim, and that's really the documenting insurable interest. Sometimes it's pretty straightforward, it's pretty easy, but other times it can be a lot more challenging out there because you have to go through certain stages in order to properly identify that. And this is really adjuster's responsibility to document the insurable interest of the named insured or any other parties that have an interest on the claim, even down to the lien holder, because they may have an interest in the claim. They may have an interest in the contents. And so it's important for us to make sure we document that. And even under the flood claims, under the standard flood insurance policy, even the policy and the manuals state that the policyholder must investigate with the coverage. They must provide that. Down here on general conditions C, your interest, for example, owner, and the interest of any others in that damaged property. And then under options after loss, any policies of property insuring you against loss and deed establishing your ownership of the insured real property. So here, there's multiple times this is stated. And so this is where we have to be involved. When you see multiple names on a policy or the names don't match the building, there's something that's just not right. Really, actually, any situation we're dealing with commercial claim, we need to make sure we are gathering all the information. The lien holders, who has basically who has insurable interest. And this could even be down to a simple contents claim. I mean, let's take, for example, Joe's Cantina. They opened a restaurant and they had to get a lien holder on their contents and fixtures. They only had contents coverage. Documentation is required. And I know when you're dealing with residential and dwelling claims in a lot of cases, you immediately assume, oh, they own the contents. They own the contents. But we're dealing with commercial claims. There's a good chance that there's a lien holder that's involved on those contents, and we need to make sure we document that. And if there's not, what do we need to do? We need to document that again. And it's not just, oh, Joe Smith told me they did not have a lien holder. We need something in writing that states they do not have a lien holder to put that on the actual reporting as well. Let's see some other, get to my next slide here. Some other situations with insurable interest, circumstances where both the policy holder, maybe it's the owner of the building, maybe they had the contents. Sometimes, like I said earlier, sometimes the situation is nice and clean. It's easy to identify. There's Joe Smith is the named insured and Joe Smith is on the ownership and everything is nice and pretty and great. But there's other scenarios where it's just a little more challenging. There's variations, combinations where it just becomes a lot more difficult. And so as an adjuster, we need to go through and we need to verify. We need to document these things. We need to know who has what interest, where's the interest. When a claim is reported, the ownership must be verified. The parties involved must be identified. We have to document who owns the building. We have to document who owns the buildings. We have a checklist, and you should use a checklist when you go out there. Some of the things like we talked about, the key players, that's on the checklist. Verify they have a lease, verify there's a mortgage company, who owns what. We need to make sure we document this stock, who owns the stock, who owns the building. We got to get down into the details of all this ownership to make sure that before you go out and before you write an estimate, you're writing an estimate for the named insured or whoever's involved that actually has a financial interest in that. I've seen too many situations where an adjuster will write an estimate, turn it in, go, where's the ownership docs? We don't see proof that they have financial interest, and they come back and go, here's the ownership docs, and you look at them, and it is correct. They did not have a financial interest in the building, should not have had a policy to begin with, and there's no estimate written. And like I said earlier, guess what happens? The adjuster does not get paid. So, all right, Raven, I've invited Raven on today, and I know she's having some little bit of difficulty with her camera, so I'm just going to let Raven jump in. Raven, talk to us real quick about this building ownership verification, some of the things that y'all do as a team here in the building ownership, the business owner verification.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for having me on. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Okay, perfect. So as Craig stated, I'm just going to briefly go over the documentation that's needed to prove ownership. So first thing, as adjusters, you go out, you receive a loss notice. The name insured could be a corporation or LLC. There are a few additional steps that you'll have to take in order to prove ownership of who owns the building, who owns the business, personal property, or the stock. So here on this slide, you can see first column, building owner verification. So if you are able to obtain at least one of the documentation listed here, it will help you prove who owns the building. So number one, if you're able to obtain the county assessor tax documents, the master deed, or the lease, and making sure all the tenants are listed on the lease, that will help you prove who owns the building. Second, to help proving who owns the business, if you can try to attain at least one of these documents, articles of incorporation, tax documents, business license, annual report, deed of trust. This will help you prove who owns the business. Now, the next slide will show you where you can find this information from.
I'm going there. Sorry.
Okay, you're fine.
Okay.
Okay, so most important, I know you're like, where can I find this? So this website here, publicrecords.net, are online, completely free. Don't have to set up an account, anything like that. So you'll go to this website. The only thing you'll need is zip code. Use the zip code of the loss address, and you'll be prompted with the official state website where you can find articles of incorporation. You'll also be prompted with the link to the state UCC search website. Here's where you can find the annual report. You'll also see a deed record of deeds link. Here's where you can find deed of trust. And then lastly, you'll see link to county tax assessor where you can find tax documents. You also may see the mapping GIS. This is just another resource where you can find additional tax documents. But like I said, most important, this where we research and to gather this basic information from this website here. And one just a little tip, just want to throw out, just making sure when we do gather that the documentation to make sure that the individual in the organization that's going to be authorized for signing the events, signing the proof, just try to make sure that person name is on at least one of those documents. So that's all I have. I'll
Perfect.
pass it back over
Perfect.
to you.
Thank you, Raven. Appreciate that information. That's very valuable information to have. And, you know, like Raven said, we do this in office. We also expect the adjusters to do this as well. So it's just don't rely on us to get this information. You should be all looking at this as well, because I'm gonna give you a couple examples here and on some situations we've seen happen. And here, I mean, without, you know, like this one here is pretty clean, pretty straightforward. Bob's, and I probably should have changed this to something else because every time I try to say, I'm saying a different word. Bob's Crab Shop. Owns the policy, owns the building, occupies the building, owns the contents. But we still need to go out and look at the copy of the deed or tax documentation. We still need to get a statement addressing the building occupancy, that there's no lease or tenants. And I'm talking about a statement, not just a verbal, hey, I don't own anything, there's no lease, but and also who owns the contents. And then a statement addressing other insurance, if there is other insurance. That doesn't cover the building, does it cover the contents. This is very important as well, which we're going to get to in just a second. Here's another quick example where it's a little more difficult. We have a situation now where there's a tenant involved. The tenant occupies the building. There is a building owner, which is Bob's Crab Shop. There's a triple net lease where the rent, tax, and insurance. And here, okay, again, deed or tax documentation, copy of current leasing, you know, who has the insurable interest, copy of the statement addressing who has other insurance. All this information has to be gathered and documented. And I know we're kind of running out of time, but I wanted to get to, we're going to come back to that one real quick because they'll talk about tenant coverage. But since we're talking about leases and the responsibility, I wanted to bring Michelle on, because when we get to leases and lease agreements and things like that, there's a lot that goes into a lease agreement. There's a lot that we need to be doing that goes into the lease agreement. When we identify that there's a tenant involved, we need to find out, does the tenant have insurance? Is there betterment improvement? Who's responsible for coverages? Who's responsible for, there's multiple things that go into a lease agreement that we need to make sure we're documenting, and that is going into our narrative. And this kind of goes back to the other insurance as well, because we will be able to identify other insurance. And sometimes the lease agreement will even say, hey, there's other insurance involved. And since there's other insurance involved, we need to make sure that other insurance is not covering a proportional loss. Is it excess? Is it covering flood? Does it not cover flood? There's a lot that goes into that. And again, our requirements even state that the policyholders should be providing us with information on other insurance, and that we can actually request information regarding other insurance. But what about the lease agreement? There seems to be a challenge out there for some that don't understand the lease agreement. And when you look at a lease agreement, there are several sections out there, you know, on who understand who has responsible for the construction, installation, who's responsible for the insurance. And if you look at the different leases, there's always a different title to that, you know, tenant, construction, installation, alterations, or maybe maintenance, repairs, and replacement, or maybe just tenant alterations. But we still need to look at these sections of the lease agreement. And I know Michelle's going to jump here in just a second. Are you on camera? I don't see. Yeah, there you are. I know she can jump here in just a second. And I know I like to talk a lot, and I know we're running out of time. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle, because I know she's our lease agreement guru. So Michelle, have at it.
Great, thank you. And I'm going to try to condense this pretty fast. So, questions at the end, because I might talk a little bit fast, but, there is GP coverage available to both owners and tenants, and the policy and the manual both state that we as adjusters have the responsibility to fully document the loss. And that includes leases, copies of other policies, and even estimates written for the loss, even if they're not for our insured. When we're handling a commercial property claim, we must get an executed copy of the lease, which is going to be signed and dated by all parties, and any of the tenant policies. Now, obviously, we need to keep it in the front of our minds if we are insuring the owner or the tenant, but either way, we're still going to need to have all documentation for both parties. We need the lease, any policies for both parties, and the contact information for the adjusters handling any other claim involved in the loss. This lease is going to tell us if the tenant is required to have flood insurance. And no matter which party we insure, this is going to be very important. And we're going to talk about why in just a minute. Once we dig into this lease, we'll know who owns the betterments and improvements and any interior fixtures. Some leases are going to tell you that anything the tenant installs in the building transfers and become property of the owner of the building at the termination of the lease. Some leases are going to say that these accessory items are going to be retained by the tenant and they'll take them with them when they leave. And we need to know that information and verify that any property we are insuring is being properly documented. We also need to be very aware that the GP policy states that there is coverage be available for improvements made by the tenant at their expense, even if they cannot legally remove those items. So that means that the tenant policy may be responsible for the improvements that they are not going to own at the termination of the lease. So we need to make sure that we know which policy is stepping in for that coverage, and we need to make sure that we are recommending payment that is full and correct. There's always going to be a section in a lease that's going to state the tenant's maintenance and repair obligations. This section is usually going to state the tenant will maintain, repair, and replace the interior of the property and all improvements and fixtures, even walls, doors, windows, structural interior items like those. And most adjusters get to that point of the lease and stop reading because it says the tenants are responsible for repair. The problem is that this section usually only applies to general wear and tear items that the tenant has enjoyed the use of, and that is, excuse me, not actually going to be the tenant's responsibility after a loss caused by flood. Or anything that's outside of the normal enjoyment of a tenant. So that's what you need to be really aware of. Always read the full lease, looking for a section that details a landlord's obligation to rebuild. And like Craig said, these often have, there's a ton of different titles that you may see for this, but this is why it's so important to read. There's going to be different headings that you're looking for, but basically you're looking for the language that states which policy is responsible in the case of a weather event. Some leases require the landlord to waive the rent during the rebuild, and sometimes there's a legal requirement for the owner to have the property fully repaired within so many dates of the loss. And that obviously is going to create urgency for you as an adjuster. The landlord may be responsible for rebuilding the premises to the original condition at the start of the lease. Remember that each policy involved may cover items that are not owned by our insured, so we need to fully document all parties' coverages as well as all claims that are being made so that we can make sure that we're putting our client back to whole while also not issuing any duplicate payments. The majority of the time, this is not always, but the majority of the time, the damages caused by a flood are covered by the building owner's policy. So it's very important that all parts of the lease are reviewed and that the narrative fully documents the other policy, the other claim information, and the reasons why we're making the recommendations that we are, whether it's payment or denial. An example of why all this research is important comes from two claims that we've had. One, the policy was held by the building owner. The lease stated that the tenant was required to have flood insurance. The flood policy of the tenant was required to include the landlord as an insured party, and damages after a natural event would be covered by both parties. So the lease says both parties are going to be responsible. It's kind of vague. It leaves it up to the policy to determine, the lease was kind of vague, leaves it up to the policy to determine who's paying for what. This tells us right away that we know we're going to need to see the tenant's flood claim so that we're not paying any duplicates. Once we got the policy from the tenant, we realized that there's no coverage for flood at all. So this entire time they had been in violation of the lease, but no one noticed. So even though the lease stated that the tenants would be responsible for part of the flood damage, since there was no flood coverage for this tenant, the owner's policy had to be fully responsible for the loss. Because remember, at the end of the day, they're the one with the financial interest and the one who's going to walk away with the property at the end of the lease. The carrier at that point could decide to pursue damages that should have been covered by the other flood policy. So that information about what is covered in the lease needs to be fully documented so that the carrier can make that determination. This estimate was written for a fraction of the actual loss, resulting in a reduced payment to the insured and a smaller paycheck for the field adjuster. We had one other claim where the policy was also covered the owner. The lease stated the tenant was responsible for interior damages. The field adjuster stopped there, wrote the claim for exterior cleaning, and recommended a denial for the interior damages. There was a second section in that lease that stated the owner was responsible to return the property to original lease conditions after a natural event. Because of a delay in turning in an estimate after a CAT, it became a challenge to fully document all of the missed items and incomplete documentation. Again, there was a recommendation of payment to our insured for much less than was owed, and the field adjuster left their own money on the table as well. So I know this has been a lot of information. Basically, the most important thing that you need to walk away with regarding leased commercial property is to make sure you get a full copy of the lease, you read the full lease, you understand the terms, review all the policies, and have an open door of communication with the tenant and the owner, as well as the other adjuster involved in the loss. I'd also strongly suggest that you be proactive during your inspection, even if you fully believe that our policy only applies to the exterior of the building. Fully photograph and document other parts of the property in case there is a problem with the other party's coverage, like we saw before, or in case there's been a mistake in interpreting the lease. Our support staff is always here to help you interpret these documents. It's a great idea to start collecting these documents immediately as soon as you get this claim loss notice. Start making a list of everything you need. Let them know right away what you're going to need. The earlier you start managing these documents and managing your claim, the less likely it is going to be that you're going to run into Craig's nuclear train wreck that sends aliens into your backyard. So we don't want that. We don't want aliens. We want to get this right the first time.
100% accurate. We don't like the nuclear bombs, and adjusters don't like it. Policyholders don't like it. And there's no reason why we should get to that point, because like Michelle's talking about, and we've stressed this beginning, is getting this information prior, letting the policyholder know, letting the named insurer know, we need this now, we need this information. And that's kind of how we'll conclude this presentation for the day. As we've gone through the key players. We've talked about ownership, the insurable interest with Raven, and the lease agreements with Michelle, and the construction with David, and the layout. I did skip photographs, but even photographs are important, especially like the pre-photographs, pre-storm photographs of the policyholder during the storm, during the tear out, and having that conversation, and just getting all the information, not just the documentation, but not the word of mouth, but the physical documents that we can see and we can navigate through and we can understand. Like Michelle's pointing out the lease, we identify that they did have coverage, and it's a situation where they didn't have coverage, and being able to just document all of this information. We don't do this 100 days in. We don't do this 20 days in. We don't do this whenever. It is handled, should be handled, and explained clearly during that first contact with the policyholder. And I know a lot of adjusters go out there and they go, I'm going to be out there tomorrow to do an inspection. Here's the time I'm going to be out there. Click, and they hang up the phone. That's not the way that call should be made. We've gone through the list. We should have a checklist. You need to identify the key players. You need to identify everything. You need to manage that claim, and you manage that claim from that contact, from that moment when you receive that loss. And if you do that, and if you're managing that claim from the beginning, it's not going to be a complex claim anymore. It's going to be simplified. It's going to be an easier process. And yeah, you're going to get into some of this boring lease agreement language that you just kind of scratch your head and go, I really don't understand all that stuff. But it's much better to do that up front than to go through the steps of writing a claim, offering advance, which you shouldn't be offering advance anyway until you determine who has insurable interest. Writing an estimate, you shouldn't be doing that anyway until you know who has insurable interest. And doing all the steps of the claim and realizing that the named insured actually did not have insurable interest, or they didn't have other insurance that actually covered flood. There's some other quirk out there that prevented them from writing that estimate, from you making a recommendation on the estimate. And you turn out at the end of the day, you did not get paid for all this time you spent, because if you just did it at the beginning and followed the checklist, you could have a claim that's simplified. That's it. We're done. Julie, I'm going to turn it over to you. I don't know if there's any questions on the, anybody has any questions or concerns. And again, before I turn over to you, Julie, I want to thank the team for joining us. And I know some people, I had Kelly on, and I apologize, Kelly. I kind of just went through some of the parts that I know you were going to talk about just a little fast, because when I get into this stuff like this and understanding the process and understanding what we should be doing and trying to drive all this information home to everybody, I just get really excited, and I just start just throwing information out there as fast as I can. And so I apologize for that, for taking over. But again, I want to thank all the team for being on and the time putting into helping, you know, have a flow of things, how we need to understand how things work, because we want, at the end of the day, the policyholder to be satisfied with the claim settlement and have a smooth and successful claim settlement. And it all starts at the beginning. It all starts at how we handle as a team, field and desk adjusters, how we're handling that claim from the beginning to make sure that that policyholder, that named insured, is getting a successful and easy claims process and settlement. Julie, I'm gonna stop talking now. It's turning over to Julie.
Okay, so we did have one question on large commercial claims. Can you use the blueprints to help you with the sketch? Would that be okay?
Is that a question for me?
You or David.
I mean, I don't see why it's not going to be the only piece that you use, but I mean, any information that we have is going to be helpful. You know, whatever you can obtain.
And we want to make sure it's the final blueprint, and you still want to quantify the measurements and go through the process. I will make a point of never, ever, ever use a PA's estimate and go off their measurements.
Well, and
ever use the contractor's estimate and go off their measurements. Okay.
And the question was actually about using it as an underlay and Xactimate. And the challenge with doing that is that the measurement transfer may not be correct. So you could definitely use it as a guide, but you don't want to use it as an underlayment in Xactimate.
Okay. All right, so I've had multiple questions for a copy of the PowerPoint, which we do not give out, but this will be on our YouTube channel tomorrow within the next 24 to 48 hours. So you can log onto there and rewatch it if you'd like. And some questions about work, anything not related to this topic, feel free to email me afterwards and I will get you to the right person or answer the question for you. And also, that's all for the questions, sir.
And I was going to say one more point about the presentation. Yeah, we sometimes we don't give this presentation out, but a lot of the information that we're covering here is actually in our commercial claims checklist guidance that we have that can be found in ClaimSource. And if anybody wants a copy of that, we can also provide a copy once you get your commercial claim. We'll provide a copy of that, which addresses a lot of the steps that we have to be doing in order to make sure we're properly handling that claim to the very, very, very end. So we don't, again, have a nuclear alien takeover that just should never happen. And again, I know I use that analogy out there because what's the worst thing that could happen besides something like that? And that's how sometimes we feel about some of these claims, because we see the little steps that could have been made and should have been taken in order to prevent that hostile takeover. So I don't have anything else, but again, team, thank you very much for being on. Appreciate your input. For those guests and everybody that joined us today, I know we ran over on some time and I apologize for that. I got a little excited about this topic and talking about it because it can be so simplified, but I want to really thank you all for being on. I think we have 2 more episodes of Claims Corner coming up. So please join us for those. And then our season 3 will come to an end. And we look forward to seeing y'all again next season. But for now, we have 2 more. For today, y'all have a great week. We will see y'all in 2 weeks. Again, team, thank you. Guests, thank you for joining us.